Welcome back. It is good to be with you. I'm Drew Mariani. You can join me here toll-free, 877-ROAM, 777. The anniversary of 9/11 now just days away. A lot of television programs you're going to be watching pieces reflecting back on what happened. It's a place where I think almost 3,000 Americans lost their lives during those horrible attacks. And it's a chapter in American history that will not soon be forgotten. And, of course, there's been a lot of animus, a lot of animosity, a lot of anger, a lot of passion being evoked on both sides of the argument right now about the projected building of a mosque and a cultural center near Ground Zero. So a lot of Americans, of course, oppose this. In fact, the New York Times realized that 2/3 of New Yorkers oppose it as well. A lot of people say, hey, wait a minute, there's more to this. There's a long history between Muslims and Christians. It goes back centuries, and building a mosque at Ground Zero is more than just building a cultural center. There is an agenda and an ideology behind this, and we should not allow it to be erected. Joining me today to talk a little bit about what we're seeing here is one of our regular guests, Dr. Grace. You can check her out online at edmundburkeinstitute.org, and if you're in traffic somewhere, of course, you'll find links at relevantradio.com, keyword Drew. She's the founder, executive director of the Edmund Burke Institute, and, of course, a former editor at the Washington Times. And, Grace, always a pleasure to have you on. Welcome back.
Thank you very much for having me, too. It's a pleasure to be on your show.
Yeah, I appreciate your article, and I know we are going to be hearing a lot more about the construction of this mosque, especially as we get closer to 9/11. I saw the mayor of New York get stopped the other day by a reporter asking him questions about this, and his position, of course, was, they've got a right to build it, and that was pretty much where a lot of people are taking their stands. Others see much more into this. I mean, if you look at it on the surface, it's one thing. But if you can step back and look at the forest and the trees and know the history of the relationship between Muslims and Christians, the erection of this mosque may paint a different picture. Your take on why it's being built and what ultimately will pan out?
Well, I don't think that it's very wise to proceed, so I'm by no means a fan of the building of this mosque at that particular site. But one of the things that I focus on in the latest article that I've written is to emphasize what it is exactly that Muslims and Christians in general have in common. And I think if we look at the origins of the Muslim faith and how the Muslims first interacted with Christians, we can see perhaps a way to move forward. Let me just start by saying that one of the things that is extremely alarming about this particular time in our history is that there's an increasing number of Americans who view the Muslim faith with a lot of suspicion and a great deal of hostility. And despite the president's effort to start a new era in Muslim-Christian relations, it seems that we're moving in the opposite direction, where Muslims and Christians are viewing each other, as I say, with a great deal of suspicion. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I point out in my article is that at the beginning, when the Muslim faith first came to the fore in the 7th century, the Muslim faith had a cardinal principle of the truth that was exactly the same as the Christian faith, and that is the conviction that monotheism was a higher form of thought. This monotheism was amongst the greatest revolutionary principles beginning in the ancient world with the Jews and then carried forward with the Christians and then carried forward in another geographic area by the Muslims. Mm-hmm. It was one of the greatest, most revolutionary, most progressive ideas that the world had ever seen. And what we saw in the early centuries is that in some cases, even a Christian monarch in modern-day Ethiopia, for example, protected the Muslims who were fleeing prosecution from the polytheists. And Christians recognized the value of what Muslims were doing, which is bringing monotheism, spreading it further than ever before, and willing to take it, as I said, nationalize it. They were essentially taking it into a new geographic area that had not previously been. So one of the things that I point out is that there's undeniable differences between Muslims and Christians, and the differences are really profound. There's no denying that. Yet, at the same time, if you look at history and you look at the broad strokes of history, you can see how valuable this commitment to monotheism is. And that I think that in trying to untangle the mess that is being stirred now amongst Christians and Muslims, we should really focus on how valuable it is that both traditions are proponents, they are advocates of monotheism. And that means that they favor a God-centered world versus a world that is being dominated in many ways in the West, especially by liberals, who are calling for a godless world where man is the focus rather than God being the focus.
Yeah, both faiths, of course, are monotheistic. Christians, of course, believe Jesus, is the Son of God, and Muslims, of course, maintain Muhammad came to perfect the faith of the Jews and the Christians. So you got Christians, as you point out, Christ is basically the pinnacle of that faith, and will one day overcome the world. And for Muslims, Muhammad supplanted Jesus and Islam, and ultimately, their goal is to supplant Christendom. So, I mean, you got this age-old history between both of these faiths. Our president has bent over backwards to try to ultimately bring about, a spirit of unity. He apologized for, America's wrongs in that speech he gave on June 4th, that Cairo speech. Let me just, maybe you can shed some light on where we are as a nation. The president here is trying to ultimately, create this spirit, this attitude of unity and putting aside these differences. But really, you blow away that smoke, and at the core are two very different ideologies. And Islam has always been at odds with Christianity. Will we ever see peace between these two faiths?
Well, you see, as you mentioned, Drew, you're so right when you say that there are those profound differences. Muslims believe that the Islamic faith, it supplants the Christian one, that Muhammad is the final prophet, and they deny the divinity of Christ, and they deny the resurrection of Christ. Now, if you actually try to have a theological debate, one of the things you realize is that the Islamic faith and the Christian faith, they are fundamentally at odds in terms of what they envision the end of days to be. What will the final world look like? Well, Muslims believe that essentially at the end of time there will be the triumph of Islam on earth. Mm-hmm. And we Christians believe that at the end of time it will be the kingdom of God on earth. So if we focus on the end goals, we will not be able to bridge the divide. And right. That is one of the fundamental reasons why we view each other with tremendous suspicion, because we see that we ultimately have a different agenda in terms of what the world will actually ultimately look like. And that is really at the heart of the tension between Muslims and Christians, where, an act like the mosque at Ground Zero is being perceived by many Americans as the Muslims saying, we are triumphant here over right. you, and we will ultimately triumph over you in all things. Right. And Christians saying, no, you won't, and Americans reacting in part to that.
But now, there's go ahead. I don't want to step on you. We got to take a break, but when we come back, maybe we can pick it up, because I also want to highlight the fact that there are tremendous parallels here, too. I mean, both Christians and Muslims share a similar worldview, as you point out. They respect human life, family values. Whereas you take a look at our secular culture, you've got relativism, rampant individualism, atheism, sexual permissiveness, so much more. So we are on the same side of the equation on some of these issues. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Dr. Grace Voto. You can join us as well. Stay with us.